Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to read part of Sir Richard Burton's book, First Steps in East Africa, Exploration of Harar. And in this part, he tells us about the justice system of the Commonwealth of Harar, or the Sultanate of Harar. He's trying to tell us how justice was delivered in Harar in 1850s. Now, Sir Richard Burton was a British spy, and he traveled to Harar as an Arab merchant to try to collect information. And the British were so interested in getting information about Harar because they thought that information could help them capture the port of Berbera, which seems like they thought was of very high value to them during this time. Now, Richard Burton travels to Harar and he stays there for a few days, and then of course, later on, he publishes this book still in the 1850s, and he details his journey to Harar and back. And now, in this part I'm reading, is telling us how justice is delivered in Harar. Of course, Harar was a very complex, we can say, commonwealth, with laws, of course, like any other commonwealth. And of course, punishment. And of course, where you have many human beings, there is going to be crime and there are going to be disputes and things like that. And of course, then there is need for a justice system. And he says he judges civil and religious causes in person, but he allows them with little interference to be settled by the Qazi Abd el-Rahman bin Umar el-Harari. The latter, though a highly respectable person, is seldom troubled, rapid decision being the general predilection. So basically, he's trying to tell us how the Emir, who was Emir Hamid at the time when Richard Burton visited, who was the Emir of Harar, how he ruled. And he tells us that he used to, of course, most old commonwealths everywhere in the world, there was this link between the executive and the judiciary and the legislation. This thing of separation of powers is a very modern thing, of course. We know this. Very few commonwealths in the past separated this. Some did, but most did not. So you'll have a king or a sultan also becoming a judge in some matters. This was very common in the old world. It was the same thing for Harar. The emir used to also serve as a judge to some extent, but not all the way. There was a Qazi, I guess it's a Qadhi as we call them in Kenya. And he says this guy who was a Qazi used to, of course, make decisions, even though the Isawi is trying to portray his work as maybe not very efficient, but we understand. The punishments when money forms no part of them are mostly according to Quranic code. So the foundation of the criminal justice system in Harar was, of course, the Quran, the Sharia law. And he points that out. Then he continues to say, the murderer is placed in the market street, blindfolded and bound hand and foot, and the nearest kin to the deceased then strikes his neck with a sharp and heavy butcher's knife, and the corpse is given over to the relations for Muslim burial. So of course, a tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye is what it was, as it was in most old civilizations or ancient. Maybe Harari cannot qualify to be really ancient, but of course, it's an old commonwealth. So that's how it was. You took a life of someone, your life is taken. And in this case, the person who takes your life is a kin or a relative of the person who you took their life. And then he continues to say, if the blow prove ineffectual, a pardon is generally granted. This is very interesting, actually. That if the first blow did not finish you off, then you are forgiven. You are let to live. And I think maybe sometimes there are families who will forgive you, and maybe the family member will come, and in that moment they decide, you know what, I'm going to forgive this individual. Maybe they hit you in a way that is not going to take your life. He continues, when a citizen draws a dagger upon another or commits any petty offense, he is bestinodoed in a peculiar manner. Two men lay their house whips upon his back and breast, and the prince, in whose presence the punishment is carried out, gives order to stop. So there's this unique punishment I did not understand, but something that caught my attention here is about drawing a sword or a dagger on someone was a criminal offense. This caught my attention because it is my understanding, and if you come from the Ma community and you're watching this video, you can confirm that in the Ma community, the Maasai, Samburu, those people, it is a huge offense for you to draw a knife on someone or a sword. And some people ask themselves, if you come to Nairobi and you travel, or you walk in the streets, you are likely to see a Maasai man with his knife, his sword, and nobody asks question, no police asks question. But if a non-Maasai walks around with a sword, then the police are going to be on you. They are going to ask you questions. Why do you walk around with a sword? It's like in Kenya, we've come to understand the Maasai can walk around with a sword and there's no trouble. And part of that is because the Maasai are very responsible with their weapons, very extremely responsible, such that you can really antagonize them. You can really antagonize them, but they will not take that sword out. They are really disciplined that way, that you can insult them, you can really antagonize them. Maybe the only time they are going to get it out is when they are very sure that their own lives is in danger. Otherwise, if you insult them, say whatever you are going to say, they are very disciplined with it. And so I found the similar practice in Harar in this text, that it was the case that it was a criminal offense for you to draw a sword on someone. You are going to be punished. Now here they say the punishment was, we can say, corporal punishment, but among the mass, of course, you are fined. You will pay a few or some number of cattle for breaking that law. Continuous theft is visited with amputation of the hand. So if you stole, then your punishment, they are going to amputate your hand. The prison is a ward of state offenders. It is terrible because the captive is heavily ironed, lies in filthy dungeon, and receives no food but what he can obtain from his own family, seldom liberal under such circumstances, buy or beg from his guards. So seems like going to prison was not something that was very common or for the ordinary kind of crime. Like you steal, they amputate your hand, you do this, you draw a sword, maybe you get some lashes, you do some other things. The punishment was the eye for an eye, as it is said. But then there were people who would go to prison, and mostly these were like people who um, we can say people who offended the state, not actually other people, but offended the state. So I think that's what he means. And you can, maybe you are reading the same part and you have a different opinion about what it means, and I welcome your comments. And he says this: if you are arrested and you offended the state and you're arrested and you're put in prison, the state did not provide food. Your family will have to take care of that, maybe come every evening to bring you food, or every morning, or every whatever time. Yeah, so it's like if you offended the state, your punishment extended to your family in some ways. Of course, whenever we are punished in whichever commonwealth, the punishment, while it's targeted at the individual, oftentimes the family also is part of that. Fines and confiscation, as usual in the East, are favorite punishments with the ruler. So yeah, you could also be fined, just like it is maybe in Kenya today, or Ethiopia, or United States, or Tanzania, or wherever, Uganda. Fines is part of the punishment. And it seems like it was the same case in Harar. Then he says, I met a Wilenzi, an old Harari, whose gardens and property had all been cheated because his son fled from justice after slaying a man. Now, this line is very interesting for me, and for some reason. I've read Titus Livia's book, From the Founding of the City, which is a collection of books that tell the history of the ancient Republic of Rome. And there is a part where Livy tells us about the story of Cincinnatus. Now, Cincinnatus is the guy after which the city of Cincinnati in the US is named. He became a dictator during the Republic days of the ancient Roman Republic. And he starts telling us his story by talking about his son, who went by the name Caeso Quintius. Now, Caeso Quintius ended up killing someone, because that's why I say this. I found this to be very interesting, because it's exactly a copy of that. Caeso murders someone, and he's arrested, and he's taken before judges, I guess it was judges, or magistrates, and he's released on bail. He's told that you need to give out this amount of money, I don't think he actually gave out the money, but it was like, if you are not going to show up, then we are going to take this amount of property from your family. And well, guess what Queso does? Queso escapes. Queso runs away. He escapes. And when the day of the to for the case to be adjudicated comes, Queso is not where to be found. And that ended up making Cincinnatus a poor man. They took everything from him. They took everything from him, and then Livy writes that Cincinnatus just went next to a river, and he lived in a small shack, a house that not actually a house, and he lived there for several years until there was a war between Rome and some other commonwealth, and then the Romans needed him because he was considered to be a very good general. And he becomes a dictator, and then he fights and he becomes a hero because he helps Rome to overcome the enemies. But now reading this part is exactly that story where Richard Burton says he met at Wilenzi an old Harari whose gardens and property had all been escheated because his son fled from justice. Exactly the story of Cincinnatus in that one sentence. So yeah, so that is the description of Richard Burton about the justice system of Harar in the 19th century, 1850s. Those are my random thoughts.